I'm Mike McDermott, and in this video we're going to take a look at two more campaigns. The first will be the series of battles conducted by General Sherman, commanding the Union Army that marched down the railroad from Chattanooga to Atlanta, and eventually, of course, occupied and controlled the city of Atlanta. And in the second case, the Confederate Army that pulled out of Atlanta and that then attempted to move north up into Tennessee with the objective of attacking and seizing Nashville. In both cases, campaigns that were comprised of hard-fought battles that set the scene for the next phase of the Civil War. But first of all, let's look at the campaign to capture Atlanta. The defeat of the Confederates at Chattanooga in late November of 1863 brought significant changes for both sides. Confederate General Braxton Bragg and the Army of Tennessee, numbering about 60,000 men, moved south and entrenched on high ground called Rocky Face Ridge, which dominated the railroad as it ran south to Atlanta. While the rebels prepared to meet the advancing Federal Army, President Davis in Richmond lost confidence in General Bragg and replaced him with General Joseph Johnston. On the Federal side, General Grant was called to Washington, where he was promoted and placed in command of all Federal armies engaged in the war. But before leaving, he designated General William Sherman to command the military division of the Mississippi, which was comprised of a force of about 98,500 men. General Grant issued a mission-type order to General Sherman, expecting him to decide how best to accomplish that mission. And that order, in part, said, move against Johnston's army, break it up, and get into the interior as far as you can, inflicting all the damage you can against their war resources. I do not propose to lay down for you a plan of campaign, but I leave you free to exercise it in your own way. So Grant had a great deal of confidence in Sherman's ability to pursue the war. General Sherman maneuvered the rebels out of that position on Rocky Face Ridge by moving around their flank and threatening that railroad and their lines of communications farther south. Those events set the tone for much of the campaign as the Confederates were forced to withdraw to new defensive positions each time the Federals outflanked and threatened to trap them. The rebels next abandoned positions at Altoona Pass before a significant battle occurred at New Hope Bridge, where the Federals took heavy casualties. Federal Colonel Benjamin Harrison was ordered to storm a rebel battery commanding the approaches to the Confederate line at New Hope Bridge. He recalled his regiment's assault when he wrote, "We advanced across an open field in the valley and up a steep and thickly wooded hill to the assault of the enemy's breastworks, whose strength and even exact location was only revealed by the line of their fire. The men moved on with perfect steadiness and without any sign of faltering up the hillside and into the very muzzles of the enemy's artillery, which continued to fire their deadly charges of grape and canister until the rebel gunners were struck down at their guns. Having gained the outer face of their defenses, in which the enemy had four 12-pounder Napoleon guns, a battery of guns, my line halted for a moment to take breath. Seeing that the rebel infantry supports had deserted the artillery, I cheered the men forward, and with a wild yell they entered into the battery position, striking down and bayoneting the rebel gunners who had survived. A follow-on action at Dallas and Pickett's Mill caused the Confederates to move again and entrench in the vicinity of Marietta, Georgia. Possible encirclement forced General Johnston to withdraw again, and he occupied defensive positions at Kennesaw Mountain, where General Sherman changed his tactics. Convinced the rebel line was overextended, the Federals attacked head-on and suffered heavy casualties before the Confederates fell back again to what became known as Johnston's River Line along the west bank of the Chattahoochee River. And now the battle to seize and occupy the city of Atlanta began. Again, outflanked, the rebels took up new positions along Peachtree Creek, only 4 miles from downtown Atlanta. General Johnston's tactics had been to impede the Federal advance while keeping his army intact. And in response to a request for specific information, he wrote President Davis, quote, "As the enemy has double our number, we must be on the defensive. My plan of operations must therefore depend on that of the enemy. It is mainly to watch for an opportunity to fight to advantage." End quote. He was replaced the very next day by General John Hood, who was considered to be more aggressive. Well, if it was aggression that the Confederates wanted, Hood would deliver. What quickly followed was a series of Confederate assaults on Union positions that were both unsuccessful and wasteful in manpower. First, on the east side of the city, at Ezra Church, General Hood fought inconclusive but costly battles. The Confederates had been unable to stop the Federals from cutting the railroad south of the city, and General Hood was then forced to evacuate Atlanta with about 30,000 soldiers. While General Sherman had not destroyed the Confederate Army, the capture of Atlanta provided an enormous boost to Northern morale and played an important role in President Lincoln's upcoming re-election. Federal casualties for the campaign numbered 31,687 men, while the Confederate losses totaled 34,979 soldiers. A Union soldier named John Moulton wrote his mother, "Sometimes a bullet comes a little too near when I'm writing and makes me spoil a letter. A man never gets so used to them, but what he will dodge when they whistle past his ear." At about that same time, a Confederate soldier named Seabrone Sneed wrote his family. "In this army," wrote Private Sneed, "one hole in the seat of the breeches indicates a captain, 2 holes a lieutenant, and if the seat of the pants is all out, it indicates that that individual is a private soldier." A Union major named Thomas Halsey also wrote his wife, "I am still alive to date. We have had some hard fighting here. My regiment is nearly used up. We have now about 130 men for duty, and I am in command. We are now in a strong position, and I hope we may succeed in whipping the enemy here. They fight with desperate energy. This is a desperate fight we are in, and the prospect of getting out unharmed is slim. Our officers have to expose themselves, and a great many of them get killed and wounded. I hope and trust I may get out all right." Although badly wounded, Major Halsey recovered and succeeded in surviving the war. General Sherman described his perception of the war in a letter to the mayor and town commissioners of Atlanta once he took possession of the city. And this letter was in response to the mayor's plea for light treatment. General Sherman wrote, "You cannot qualify war in harsher terms than I will. War is cruelty, and you cannot refine it. And those who brought this war into our country," here he's speaking, bringing war to the United States, "they deserve all the curses a people can pour out. I know I had no hand in making this war, and I know I will make more sacrifices today than any of you," speaking to the politicians in Atlanta. The only way the people of Atlanta can hope once more to live in peace and quiet at home is to stop the war. A member of General Sherman's staff also wrote, "A grand and awful spectacle is presented to the beholder of this beautiful city, now engulfed in flames. The heaven is one expanse of lurid fire. The air is filled with flying, burning cinders. Buildings covering 200 acres are in ruins or in flames. Every instant, there's a sharp detonation or the smoldered booming sound of exploding shells and powder concealed in the buildings, and then the sparks and flame scattering cinders far and wide." General Sherman also wrote of their departure when he commenced his march across Georgia. "We rode out of Atlanta by the Decatur Road and reached the hill just outside the old rebel works. We naturally paused to look back upon the scene of our past battles. Behind us lay Atlanta, smoldering and in ruin, the black smoke rising high in the air and hanging like a pall over the ruined city." And thus ended the campaign to capture Atlanta. After abandoning Atlanta, Confederate General Hood and the Army of Tennessee were visited by the President, Jefferson Davis. His purpose was to bolster Confederate morale, which had plummeted after losing Atlanta, and devise a campaign strategy with General Hood, how to best use that Army of the Tennessee. While the President was unable to lift the feelings of the troops, he and General Hood decided that the Confederate Army should move north toward Chattanooga in hopes of drawing the Federals into a disadvantageous position. He thought that General Sherman would follow and attempt to protect his lines of communication. Although the plan remained largely unspecified, General Hood initially threatened the primary Federal line of communications, that is, that rebuilt railroad back to Chattanooga. Union troops initially pursued until General Sherman decided that he would lose 1,000 men every month and gain no positive result. And that's when General Sherman cut loose from his supply line, that is the railroad, turned his back on Atlanta, and began the march across Georgia while living off the land. General Hood initially considered pursuing the Federals, but then decided to turn north and invade Tennessee with his 39,000 soldiers. His objective was to capture Nashville and then continue on to the Ohio River. Based on future success, he anticipated enlisting an additional 20,000 men in Tennessee and Kentucky, an eventuality that simply never happened. Spending the next 3 weeks resupplying in northern Alabama, General Hood then moved north into Tennessee. The Confederates were then confronted by Union General John Schofield with a force of 35,000 soldiers who blocked the crossing of the Duck River at Columbia. General Schofield was able to block the crossing for the next 5 days, forcing the rebels to maneuver. Demonstrating in front of the city to keep the Federals' attention, General Hood crossed his army over that river at a ford that they had located east of town and then moved to outflank the Federal defenses. Coincidentally, the Union troops were in the process of withdrawing from those defenses. They were withdrawing back toward Nashville. The Union supply trains and artillery with an infantry escort were on the road and moving north to Franklin, some 30 miles away, and they were at the town of Spring Hill just in time to intercept rebel cavalry approaching in advance of General Hood and his infantry, who were intent on blocking a possible Union withdrawal. Quickly establishing a defensive line with the 34 guns and the infantry support available, the Federals stopped the initial rebel advance. As it became dark, the main force of Confederate infantry arrived, and to the surprise of the badly outnumbered Federals, the rebels stopped and went into bivouac for the night. At that point, the Union Army's rear guard, escorting the wagon train and so on, became its advance guard and held the road open for General Schofield and the bulk of his soldiers who evacuated Columbia during the night. Because of General Hood's overconfidence and a series of command failures, the Federals were able to escape a very dangerous situation and consolidate their forces at Franklin the following day. The close proximity of encamped rebels and moving Federals caused a number of close calls during the night as individuals mistakenly wandered. In one instance, two Confederates were sitting near the road beside a low fire that they had built when a man strolled up out of the dark and asked, "What troops are you?" When told, he turned and walked back into the darkness. "Say, wasn't that a Yankee?" "Let's go get him," one of the rebels said. His companion replied, "Let him go. If you're looking for Yankees, go on down to the road and you can get all you want." Once arriving at Franklin, the Union defense formed a semicircle south of the town with both flanks resting on the Harpeth River behind them. Once the Union Army had arrived, engineers were soon hard at work planking a railroad bridge and repairing a burned wagon bridge to ensure communications were open up to Nashville, which was only 18 miles farther north. The attacking Confederates would be confronted by a ditch about 4 feet wide and 3 feet deep, then a wall of earth and wooden fence rails 4 feet above the normal ground level, and finally a trench 3 or 4 feet deep in which those Union soldiers would stand, aiming their weapons through narrow gaps formed by the logs on top of the earthen wall. More than 60 pieces of artillery with strong infantry support were placed on high ground north of the river, that is, behind the Union position, to cover the entire front as well as any possible flanking attacks, thus completing a formidable defensive position. General Hood ordered an all-out frontal assault, even though his artillery had not yet arrived. And 18,000 Confederate infantry, concentrated against the Union left, stepped off to cross more than a half mile of level ground in front of the defenses. 2 brigades of Union troops had been posted forward of the lines, and they were taken by surprise and quickly overrun. 700 men were captured, while the frantic survivors were chased into the Federal defenses by the charging rebels. A Union colonel later wrote, "The triumphant Confederates, now more like a wild howling mob than an organized army, swept on with hardly a check from any quarter. So fierce was the rush that a number of the fleeing soldiers, officers and men, dropped exhausted into the ditch behind the wall and lay there while the terrific contest raged directly over their heads." Union reserves stopped that assault, which had become a point-blank exchange of fire, and follow-on Confederate attacks were also defeated with the help of massed fire from the artillery batteries on the high ground to the rear. An hour after dark, General Hood committed his reserve division to be shot apart, and the fighting continued sporadically until about midnight. General Hood renewed the attack at first light with an artillery bombardment, which was stopped when it became obvious that the Union defenses were empty. General Schofield and his troops had pulled out during the night and were in the process of moving into Nashville's primary defenses. Union casualties totaled 2,326 men, and the Confederate losses numbered almost 3 times as much, 6,252 men, to include 54 brigade and division commanders, roughly half of the senior leaders that were present. Another demonstration of how, at that time, commanders led from the front. General Hood had seriously damaged the Army of Tennessee from the top to the bottom. General Hood later provided an explanation of why very few men joined his ranks after leaving Alabama. And he wrote, "I felt convinced that the Tennesseans and Kentuckians would not join our forces since we had failed to defeat the Federal Army." A man named Sam Watkins, a Confederate soldier in the 1st Tennessee Infantry Regiment, provided his assessment of his Army commander when he wrote, "As a soldier, General Hood was brave, good, noble, and gallant, and fought with the ferociousness of the wounded tiger and with the everlasting grit of the bulldog. But as a general, he was a failure in every particular." Once the Confederates discovered that the Union Army had pulled out of the defenses near Franklin and had moved north during the night and gone into prepared positions near Nashville, General Hood and his army followed and also moved north with every intention of carrying the battle to the Federals. And that story will be included in an upcoming video. Until then, please make any comments concerning either these campaigns or any of the others that we've done so far, and I will make every effort to engage in a positive and constructive conversation. And until then, God bless America.